Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Barblog. And we continue our discussion of text, almost as a codex, about what happened to the base builder tendency. Now, for some of you, this is an exploration of some obvious things, but for others, it's an interesting look at limitations of certain things that we think we know and we think we understand. Um, I've also talked about the internal criticisms of the Marxist-Leninist tendency, which led to a lot of those groups dissolving in the 80s. And all this tends to be based off of, cadre formations that require a whole lot of upfront investment and time and a lack of other responsibilities. Now, we've already read one article on base building by Renato Flores, his postmortem on the Marxist Center, which was partially a base building center, but we need to read another one, I think, to get where Flores ended up. We've already kind of taken three cross sections of text by Sophia Burns and seeing where Sophia ended up, which seems to be outside of the activist left entirely. But let's see what Renato was in 2002. This is a letter, not an article, but nonetheless. A few months ago, I wrote an article summarizing my experiences in the base building milieu and trying to understand why we had reached an apparent roadblock. I ended on a quite pessimistic note, but promised that it was the first part of an ongoing series. Unfortunately, I have been having trouble knowing where to take the series and writing the promised follow-up. It is much easier to spot a problem than suggest a solution. Yeah, but sometimes there aren't solutions. And the quagmire the left seems to be stuck in seems much easier to state than to find a way and escape. I mean, obviously, if we knew how to escape it, then most of us would have left it. But this does not mean we shouldn't state the problems. And this is one of the issues that I have with a lot of people who come at people like, well, you've stated the problems, but you don't offer a solution. We often don't know the solution, but we know that the problems are clear. And maybe sometimes some of the things don't have a clear answer. Anyway, so I was left in a bit of an impasse. I'm still trying to think hard about how to get out of here. But I offered this short letter in hopes that to understand what mental blocks I've been facing and in hope someone can help us figure a way out rather than trying to put a detailed article forward with a mishmash of poorly thought out ideas that will be diluted in an ocean of information and will be rendered meaningless. That's common for most of these things. The two propositions I'm currently wrestling with are these two theses, which seem to be very true and hint at the way we should be taking. One, in a mediaized world, all politics of liberation must take a mediaized form. So we are back to, I mean, I hate to tell you this idea goes back to the 1950s. It's the Marshall McLuhan idea of the left, that if we can control the discourse, by controlling the discourse, we will have a lot of politics. But I hate to tell you folks something relatively obvious today in 2024 that maybe wasn't obvious in 2022. Yes, the discourse matters, but left dominance of the discourse led to its own undoing. And they did have disproportionate sway, even on centrist talking points from 2018 to about 2022. So I'm not so sure Renato actually found a way out here. This seems to be the problem I repeatedly hit with base building. We're trying to operate on the base in a very unmediated way. On the contrary, our rivals, which control the media and control many other spheres, can mobilize and organize at a much larger scale than we can. I mean, no, they're not always mobilizing and organizing. All they have to do is get voters out, which is a very different ask than what you're trying to do. We are really in an unfair terrain. That's true. In fact, one of the things I say is there's always a difference between those fighting for a status quo or even a prior status quo than those who want to create something entirely new. The latter is a harder proposition at all times. They can pour money into media projects to recapitulate rebellious energy in right-wing manners. CF Peter Thiel. While we are stuck knocking on doors, it was millions where we are lucky to get to thousands. But politics isn't about what you do at the national level. I mean, this is actually, to be quite frank, taking the exact wrong lesson. The only place where I could see this impasse being briefly broken was the Bernie presidential run. Where we burnt everything down for something that we didn't build the ground basis to lift up, making it a spectacular event. Oh boy. Which I mentioned. Without failing in the reformism and thinking that Bernie can save us, it is still worth reflecting on why working class people related to U.S. politics through the ballot primarily, and how we can both use that and expand on that. Well, they basically rejected you. This was the meaning of this sentence, which people read as a plea for the ballot box. Rather than that, it was a plea to understand why only a presidential primary has given us the ability to bring people to our side on a relatively level playing field. You weren't on a relatively level playing field, my friend. That's become more obvious now, but that should have been apparent by 2022. The George Floyd protests also gave us access to the mass media, but those legacy of those protests is, for now, much worse than the Sanders run and has been far more recaptured by the system. No, the Sanders run was also pretty recaptured by the system. You revitalized the center of the Democratic Party. The Sanders momentum and the DSA's momentum from 2016 to 2020 is part of the narrow reason why Joe Biden ended up in office. To me, this is taking the exact wrong lesson. I must mention that some leftist streamers retrieve large audiences. They largely have reformist and or self-serving politics. Plenty of left streamers achieve large audiences, but you can't tell how large or organic those audiences are if they're actually in one place enough to actually have an effect on local politics. You can have millions of people in a country of 330 million and not have the concentrated people in any one place outside of New York City dominated by Democrats to really do anything. As I wrote earlier with Amelia Davenport, what is the social industry or even social media strategy of organizing? God damn it, we're back to this shit again. It seems to me that the question still needs answering, and this is far more urgent than ever, except that you have less and less access to this, and that's more and more commodified now than it was even when this was a dumb talking point in 2012. Occupy Wall Street had the same answers to the same questions, and that led to Bernie. In some ways, you are stuck in a circular feedback loop because most people aren't in the milieu for long enough to know the long history of these things, and they're not interested enough to know either. Now, this isn't Renato's fault. This is the fault of the political programs that we have. People can often study the stuff in the new left because it's more readily available. We've had literally a cottage industry analyzing it for fucking a generation and a half. But doing that on the immediate effects of the left, that's a different problem. And the media people, the Jacobin people, those were media people. I mean, part of the DSA's ascendance was that they played media really well post-Occupy when ad busters and the media landscape around the anarchist milieu of Occupy, CNET, ad busters, etc., collapsed. All right. One cannot decouple the problem of motivating the masses from the problem of writing a political program. I think this is actually probably a better point. Which is not to say, I mean, I think the base builders may ignore media, but we're talking about it because some base builders wrote some media. So even then, that's a little bit of an overstatement. This idea that politics starts at the mass recognition in the ballot box, which admittedly Renato's not saying. Renato's saying we need mass recognition, period. But you have to control the media forms to do that, and you don't. I mean, this is actually in miniature the same kind of trajectory that you see in a lot of the Gen X left that ended up on the shores of history pretty profoundly. I think this problem was touched upon but not recognized deeply. Yes, of course, we want a program that speaks to the masses, but it seems that we kind of know what the masses demand and or have a good idea of what the program is to get socialism. I don't think you do. Otherwise, we'd have much more success. This is one thing where I think the programmatic point is good, but the idea that you know what your immediate demands are, no. And we just have to motivate them enough to get them to reliable fighters on our side. Some theories of how this happened are around, most famously the Trotskyist transitional program, which intends to place demands the capitalists cannot satisfy, and once they're not satisfied, the masses will become revolutionaries. That's the Cliffite understanding of the transitional program, by the way. That's not the general understanding, but Marx explicitly said to Guadet his about the French socialists doing that very thing. I am not a Marxist. Don't do that. It will only lead the masses to not trust in you. Why do people continue to bring things up that are so old and failed that Marx himself commented them as failed strategies, and somehow they get pulled out of the Trotskyist transitional program because that was the Tony Cliffite, the dominant Trotskyist school in America for a long time. I mean, they're gone now, but interpretation of what was going on. Anyway, but this doesn't work. Yeah, it doesn't work. Thank you. Other tendencies barely have answers beyond the strategy of patience are going to the masses. This failure is quite universal. Yeah, the idea of just going to the masses, everyone thinks that. Strategy of patience is just wait until it happens. I'm not saying that strategy of patience is wrong. In fact, there are times for it, but the strategy of patience is for the alignment of, in Leninist terms anyway, objective and subjective conditions. If you understand what the objective and subjective conditions are, I'm not so sure we are in a place that we understand where the objective and subjective conditions are. So Renato is making a good point here about the Trotskyists, and they weren't the first to invent this, and the Cliffite interpretation of this idea. And I know a lot of people push that idea. Right. Strategy of patience and going to the masses. I mean, in some ways, even like communization is a strategy of patience that applied to catastrophe. And then teaching people how to do socialism because of riots and self-organization. Yeah. I am personally responsible for thinking in the past that we need a good story and a recourse to the past. Nowadays, I look at the essay with a mixture of shame and pride. Some things are what were right, others were very wrong. Happens to all of us, my friend. I am willing to give it. So I was kind of harsh on Renato in the first part of this, but I want to give him credit. I believe them credit. That there really is a sincere struggle here, right? The reason why the mediatized thing is important is because media is an outlet if you already have the other institutions built. But there's this way of ignoring that you are competing with people who have institutions that built to intervene in the media with social things that can manifest with social things. I mean, like newspapers, outgroups, think tanks, etc., church outreach, etc., that can mobilize locally that have the base already built. Even with Bernie, it was skipping the intermediate difficult part and hoping that doing it through the Democratic Party would give you the intermediate difficult part, but they don't hand up with those levers very easily. This problem is somehow related to the problem of culture, but it cannot be reduced to this. Yes, culture is a battlefield. I mean, it's a lot of things, but it again is a mediator or superstructure. I mean, this vulgar understanding of superstructure is a problem. Culture is also part of relations of production. Relations of production are in the base. That is why it is a feedback loop. You can't completely separate out the base from the superstructure the way a lot of Marxists want to do, because the relations of production affect the mode of production. In fact, the mode of production emerges from them. And what reinforces all that? The superstructural cultural stuff. So the attempt to rip culture off that a lot of Marxists want to do ends up either degenerating into pure volunteerism or pure economism. Neither one of those are really great. And by economism, and I realize I need to explain my words more because a lot of people are a lot less literate than they used to be. We mean believing that economic development, either positively or negatively, will automatically lead to what we need. That there is no human intervention necessary because it will be inevitable either from immiseration, which makes revolution inevitable. Sadly to say, there's no historical evidence for that, or from technological development undoing the need for capitalists and profits. The Bernsteinian evolutionary model, also picked up by Schumpeter in his Critique of Democracy. What makes present-day communism less fun or enjoyable than past communism is deeper than culture. And in this, I think we should borrow a page from psychoanalysis. Oh boy. Indeed, thesis 2 is pretty much lifted from Zizek's In Defense of Lost Causes. However, Zizek, like many others who respond to this by critiquing culture and becoming unintelligible cultural commentators sprinkled with politics that are left liberal at best or reactionary at worst. Meanwhile, the reason for critique is lost, drowning in deep academic speak. Yep. Adorno is remembered by obtuse writing and his hatred for jazz, for example, rather than his theory of culture. Absolutely. Left psychoanalysis has become a world of its own, with its own vocabulary, and practitioners just forget to return to the real world and give us a hand instead of discussing endlessly 4 or 5 prototypical cases in obscure French jargon. Then I'm not even sure they understand. In this aspect, I find the podcast Why Theory by Todd McGowan and Ryan Ingley refreshing, because despite their liberal politics and thinking AOC is the solution, do they still do that? They seem to use psychoanalysis to return to the real world. They point the finger at something tangible. Leftist politics is not enjoyable. Liberals like to flagellate themselves and derive enjoyment from that. I mean, masochism is enjoyable if you're a masochist. And self-hate is enjoyable if you hate yourself. Because you are fulfilling your own social role that you gave yourself. And far-right populism in many ways is actually enjoyable for those caught up in it for a while, having been caught up in it for a while until it's not. While Todd and Ryan do not have political answers, they're screaming at a left, sometimes fundamental. Make your politics enjoyable for everyone. Inflate giant union rats, pick an enemy and make fun of them, and much more. Most left populists are charismatic figures in one way or the other, and they make their politics appealing by their own character, but they fail over and over again. You can't talk about analyzing failure of base builders if you also don't analyze the failure of left populist charlatans who are rewarded in leftist media for failing. The biggest gets on a podcast are people who spent their life not succeeding at what they said they were setting out to do. I mean, we all like the noble underdog, but, Adorno isn't wrong that part of liking the noble underdog is regirding the system that made him so. I also could wager that the lack of enjoyment in deep left politics is why we end up doing 2 things that you can actually derive enjoyment from: go on Twitter and berate other leftists to feel a bit better about ourselves. Yes. And I try to do that less now. I've definitely done it for years, though. And drawn in biographies of thousands of books where we can reminisce about our heroes and dream to be them. See, I don't read books to reminisce about our heroes. I'm not interested in heroes. I read books to understand. Now, I actually find this very different from the way a lot of people engage with leftist material, or even when they ask me for a singular book for an idea, right? Because they want a book to give it to them, and it can't. I can't give it to you either. But my theories are derived from reading long books and applying them to my life over many years, and not just reading hagiographies to be like, oh, I wish I was like Lenin. I want to know where Lenin fucked up, because he did. And if you don't think he did, then you have to ask yourself a question. Why is the Soviet Union the second shortest surviving major political change in history that I can think of, the first being Athenian democracy? These activities are way more enjoyable than going around in circles chasing spreadsheet contacts. Yes, they are. But also, here's the thing. Sociality is enjoyable for most people. All right? But it's because it is not as instrumentalized as the way cadre builders and base builders do them. You know, organic connection is harder to do than this, which is why also scene connection tends to dominate a whole lot of the left because it's actually fun. But people have gone to the left for the same kind of thing that they used to go to music shows for. But since Spotify has killed the music show and people don't have time or inclinations or money to buy musical instruments and learn to play as much anymore, and also you can make a lot of this stuff really simply with AI and computer tools, which is democratizing, and yet standardizing in a way that makes it less enjoyable to make, but probably just as enjoyable to listen to. I mean, it's interesting that things that are interesting to study because they've been homogenized, like music and things that aren't, like writing. Homogenized writing is the most boring thing in the world. And I'm just talking about LLM based writing. I'm just talking about homogenized writing in general. When I used to teach people how to write form essays in university, oh my God, was it the most boring part of my life. These qualities are way more enjoyable than going around and chasing spreadsheet contacts. Yes, when we win, it feels great, but we don't win very often. I mean, to be fair, nobody wins as often as we like to think they do. Meanwhile, we are all left with is the grind, which will become a sort of identity in itself. Yes, solutions like alternative cultures are hinting at something, but I'm not sure we can achieve them with our means. Also true. This is just a bunch of thoughts, and I hope to get some discussion. I wish to find a way out as much as anyone else. To add that, we may add that it will not be easy in the global north. After Syriza, Brexit, and Trumpism, the left has been reduced to defenders of the system. Yeah, this is true too. This is a post 2016 challenge. We can only make the collapse slower because any significant challenge actually risks relatively comfortable livelihood of many. This is why we end up with slogans like another world EU is possible, a recognition that things still need to change with the EU to keep the majority of people above subsistence line. But this is a topic for further elaboration. Now, I've been coming down hard on Flores's ideas here, but Renato actually is thinking a lot more than a lot of people I deal with in the left. What most people do when they start hitting these walls is they double down until they completely burn out and leave the left. That's why there's about a 5 to 6 year cycle for most leftists. And if you don't know that, I can tell you for sure that it's the case. I have been doing this for long enough that I've seen these cycles rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall. I'm not sure I would still be here if I wasn't A, in a union, B, devoted to that. Even though I'm very frustrated with what I do in my union. And if circumstances in my life haven't made this part of how I address and understand the world. But even there's a danger because if you make leftism and left media your livelihood, you risk, turning into a pundit where solving the problem would put you out of a job. Particularly if you solve the problem before there's a massive revolutionary change that makes needing that said job less likely. So there's a bunch of perverse incentives in here either way. But there's a short shelf life to leftists. The question people should ask more thoroughly is why? Protect your peace and maybe ask that question to yourself. Take care.